Hello and welcome to another episode of A Brief History. Today's episode, Banjo-Kazooie. Ready, set, go. Twycross, Leicestershire, England, 1995. Being fresh off the heels of their groundbreaking, critically acclaimed hit Donkey Kong Country, British developers Rareware were ready to take things even further, aiming to create their biggest and greatest Super Nintendo game to date. Codenamed Project Dream, this game was originally conceived as an adventure RPG featuring a young boy named Edison who got tangled up in a conflict with a group of pirates led by Captain Black Eye. However, as Dream got further and further into development, the game went through a large number of changes. Some of these changes were small but interesting, such as the boy Edison being switched out for an anthropomorphic bear, and other changes were a lot bigger, such as the game completely changing genres. You see, during the development of Dream, after encountering a number of technical issues, Rare shifted development to the much more powerful Nintendo 64. However, performance issues persisted, and it was around this time that Project Dream's dev team were able to take a look at early builds of another upcoming Rareware Nintendo 64 game, 12 Tales Conquer 64. In response to this, the Project Dream team decided that their game just wasn't going to be able to stand up against Conquer, so they scrapped Dream's RPG approach and completely reworked it into a Super Mario 64-style 3D platformer much like Conquer. What finally resulted from this strange development cycle was Banjo-Kazooie, released for the Nintendo 64 on June 29th, 1998. In this game, players assumed the role of a bear named Banjo and his bird friend Kazooie, both carried over from Project Dream, in their attempts to rescue Banjo's sister Tootie from the evil witch Gruntilda. And this was done by exploring multiple open-world levels while collecting a large number of items that were needed to progress, all with a wide variety of special moves and power-ups to help you along the way. While not Banjo's first appearance in a game, having previously been featured as a playable racer in 1997's Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Kazooie was the game that shot the bear and bird into the public eye, receiving universal critical acclaim, with many critics describing it as a far more refined enhancement of the formula that Mario 64 had established 2 years earlier. So between 1995 and 1998, Banjo-Kazooie had gone from a quirky pirate RPG for Super Nintendo to becoming one of the most beloved and successful games in the entire Nintendo 64 library. In fact, Banjo-Kazooie was so successful that Rare began to work on a follow-up almost immediately after the game's release. And 2 years later, on November 19th, 2000, Rare and Nintendo released Banjo-Tooie for the Nintendo 64. This sequel retained every single aspect that made its predecessor so successful while simultaneously improving on it in virtually every way, with better graphics, larger levels, new playable characters, and more varied forms of gameplay. And this approach earned Banjo-Tooie an unbelievably positive critical response, with review scores on par with Banjo-Kazooie's. Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie represent a golden age for the Rare company, a time when they could seemingly do no wrong, releasing some of the most well-remembered Nintendo 64 games of all time, including GoldenEye 007, Perfect Dark, Donkey Kong 64, and Conker's Bad Fur Day. And of all the games released during this time period, the Banjo-Kazooie games stand out as arguably Rare's biggest achievements with an original IP. And of course, they were once again ready and willing to follow up, even teasing at a third installment at the end of Banjo-Tooie and via a GameCube tech demo. But I'm sure by now we all know how the story goes. 2 years after the release of Banjo-Tooie on September 24th, 2002, the entirety of the Rareware company was bought out by Microsoft. This, coupled with the quickly changing landscape of the gaming scene, left Rare unsure what exactly to do with their beloved bear and bird. Fearing that a straightforward platformer would fail to sell, Rare tossed around a handful of ideas over the next few years. However, while Banjo-Kazooie may have been absent in the home console world, in the meantime, the Bear and Bird began experimenting with their first ever handheld games. And since Microsoft had no portable systems, and this was a time prior to the release of the PSP, these handheld spin-offs were released exclusively for the Nintendo Game Boy Advance. The first of these GBA games came in the form of 2003's Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge, which aimed to bring the franchise's open-world 3D platforming formula onto the mostly 2D sprite-based Game Boy Advance by utilizing an isometric 2.5D overhead perspective. This game was then followed up in 2005 with a racing title known as Banjo-Pilot. Originally conceived as a GBA follow-up to Diddy Kong Racing, Banjo-Pilot was a mascot kart racer based entirely around flying planes rather than driving cars. Both of these games were developed by Rare, published by THQ, and were received generally well, with Grunty's Revenge seeing a mostly positive reception and Banjo-Pilot seeing a more mixed response. But spin-off games aside, the Banjo-Kazooie series had been completely dormant ever since Banjo-Tooie's release in the year 2000. The world would not see a new home console installment to the Banjo-Kazooie franchise until November 11th, 2008 with Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Released for the Xbox 360 over a decade after the release of the original Banjo-Kazooie, Nuts and Bolts was a pretty big departure from the series' norm. As I mentioned previously, following the Microsoft buyout, the ever-elusive Banjo 3E was mulled over for a long time as Rare were trying to figure out how to bring Banjo into the next generations of gaming. Ideas considered consisted of everything from a remake of Banjo-Kazooie, which would feature various unexpected changes, somewhat reminiscent to the Xbox remake of Conker's Bad Fur Day, as well as a new, more traditional platformer that would see Gruntilda following Banjo and Kazooie across various different worlds, attempting to outdo them. However, all of these ideas were scrapped in favor of perhaps the strangest option they could have gone with: cars. Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was a vehicle-based action-adventure game which focused on constructing different forms of cars in order to participate in various challenges across multiple worlds. There was some on-foot gameplay to be found, but other than that, about 80% of Nuts and Bolts requires the use of a vehicle. And while this approach was a giant deviation from expectations and was very disappointing to those expecting a game in the style of Banjo 1 and 2, Nuts and Bolts was actually received very positively, with reviews averaging out at around an 8 out of 10, mainly citing the game's gorgeous graphics, incredible musical score, replay value, and design. But critical reception aside, in the years since its release, Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts has become infamous among the gaming community due to its failure to deliver the real next-gen Banjo-Kazooie experience that gamers had waited 8 years for. Not to mention its seemingly contemptuous attitude towards fans of the original Banjo game. And following the release of Nuts and Bolts, Banjo-Kazooie went back into hibernation as Rare shifted their focus towards developing Connect games. And this is a hibernation which has unfortunately continued to this day. It has currently been 7 years since the release of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, and in that time, all we have seen are Xbox Live Arcade re-releases of Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie on the Xbox 360. However, on May 1st, 2015, a Kickstarter was launched for a spiritual successor to the Banjo-Kazooie franchise titled Yooka-Laylee. Independently developed by the original Banjo-Kazooie team under the name Playtonic Games, Yooka-Laylee aims to recapture the magic of not only the original Banjo-Kazooie games, but also that of Donkey Kong Country and Donkey Kong 64. Playtonic's goal was to raise £175,000 on Kickstarter to help fund their project. However, this goal was easily surpassed in less than 40 minutes, eventually going on to raise £2,090,104, nearly 12 times their initial goal. Yooka-Laylee is scheduled for an October of 2016 release for all major consoles and operating systems, and its success is a true testament to just how beloved the Banjo-Kazooie games were and still are. And perhaps coincidentally, later that same year at E3 2015, Rare announced Rare Replay, a collection of 30 classic Rareware titles all compiled onto one disc for just $30. Recently released for the Xbox One on August 4th, 2015, Rare Replay was created as a celebration of Rareware's 30th anniversary as a company and features all three main series Banjo-Kazooie games, Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, and Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Not to mention other Rare gems like Battletoads, Killer Instinct Gold, Jet Force Gemini, Viva Pinata, and of course Conker's Bad Fur Day. And it doesn't end there, for right after announcing Rare Replay, Rare debuted a preview for another new game called Sea of Thieves, a pirate-themed MMO adventure game for Xbox One and PC. A pirate-themed RPG adventure game. Now, how does that sound familiar? Banjo-Kazooie was arguably one of the most influential franchises of its genre back in the late 90s and early 2000s. It, along with games like Super Mario 64, were held as the standard for what all subsequent 3D platformers would strive to be. While it may not have been the most long-lasting franchise, its place in today's industry is still undeniable. And with Yooka-Laylee coming up in the next year, Rare Replay having just been released, and Sea of Thieves possibly signifying the return of Rare, I think it's safe to say that this long-hibernating bear and bird duo could finally be beginning to stir. But until that day comes, if you just can't get enough Banjo-Kazooie content, you can always head over to my second channel, Foot of Affair 2, where I have just started a Banjo-Kazooie Let's Play series. It's a very conversational podcast-style take on the Let's Play genre, and I would really appreciate it if you checked it out. It's like going on an ocean cruise, except there's no boat and you don't actually go anywhere. Anyway, that's all I got for you this time, so thanks for watching, guys. DFTBA.